Welcome to Like It Is. This edition will feature another profile on a significant figure in our history, and in this case, in more ways than one. This historic person, you see, is an historian who, with his dynamic way of presenting history, has won a large following all over the nation. His specialty in history is Egyptology. His name, Professor Yosef Ben-Jochannan, affectionately known as Dr.Ben.
Hear it commonly said in your church, synagogue, or wherever, that Moses, Moshe, received the 10 Commandments, and thus men got laws. Men had laws long before that, thousands of years. Moses is not until 1346, before the Christian era will give us to about the 18th dynasty. Amenhotep IV, otherwise known as Akhenaten, died before Moses was born.
Dr. Ben has lectured widely across this nation, Africa, the Caribbean, and Europe. He's been a long-standing member of the Cornell University History Department. His central theme has been to emphasize that the renowned Egyptian culture was built by Africans who were black. His many appearances on Like It Is have reaffirmed this.
The ultimate to this was the destruction, trying to destroy the face of the symbol of the god Harmachis, which they call the Sphinx of Giza, which Napoleon ordered his lieutenant to blow away the face. And that's the damage to it. It is even documented by one of his men that was in, Count Vivian Dinant, who was there with Volney and others, and write these evidence of what took place. Your 21 gun salutes come from that, with 21 guns it took to shoot the face partially off.
Dr. Ben's activities have not been limited to academia. He's been a loud spokesman for African nationalism long before it became popular. He was among those who attended the Harlem funeral of Malcolm X, despite bomb threats at the time. Recently, Dr. Ben sat with us and recounted some aspects of his life, going way, way back.
I was born in 1918, December 31st, Ethiopia.
New Year's Eve.
New Year's Eve. I guess my mother said I wouldn't wait.
In Ethiopia?
Yes.
What part?
Gondar. Now there's a lot of argument about that, is that being in the Virgin Islands as a small kid, and the transfer of the island from the Danish to the American, there were a point in which you had to be proclaimed an American citizen or Danish citizen or not. And papers were transferred. And so for many of us youngsters, we wound up with American papers of the Virgin Islands, and so there were some disarrangements or so, but didn't bother me one way or the other.
How did you get from Ethiopia across the Atlantic?
Well, according to the family, is that my father went to Brazil to work as one of the people in the Consul General office, and the transfer of coffee, the trade between the coffee, and that's how he went down there.
That's what he did for a living? That was his profession, or what?
His profession was barrister, and barrister and quote-unquote gentleman farmer.
Where is he from?
He was born in Ethiopia.
He's an Ethiopian?
Yeah. My mother's a Puerto Rican.
What did your father look like?
My father looked exactly like me.
You looked exactly
the older
like
I get, the more I look like my father.
No, was he home much or what?
Well, my father was between farming and law, and at a short time he taught at a place, the Moravian School in, I think it's called Friedenstedt. There were 3 Moravian churches, one in Christiansted, one in Frederiksted, and one in the countryside, a place called Friedenstedt. And he did some student teaching there. That means he taught. So he did a few different things. And on the other hand, my mother and I had nothing in common.
Really?
You couldn't tell that my mother was my mother. By looking at us, there was no way in the world you could tell.
And she was from where?
Born in Puerto Rico, the eastern end. In Fajardo, the family, primarily the family were in St. Croix, St. Thomas, and Fajardo. the eastern end of Puerto Rico, and a number of them were in the island off there called Vieques. They originally migrated from Yemen, the group, to Spain. They were called Ladinos, and then they wind up in Puerto Rico. In making a study of the background, for instance, my mother's mother was called, her name was Seppi. My mother's father was Cruz, a Cruz. And so between those two families, then another part of the family in Puerto Rico is called Matas, Dr. Henrico Mata and so forth. I knew much of that part. And there was another part that went to Cuba called Haywood. My mother had a twin sister, and she went to Cuba, and that part of the family became Haywoods.
What religion were you born into?
I was born into the Hebrew religion, and in the Virgin Islands, unfortunately, there was only one synagogue. And it was.
Wait a minute, who was Jewish? Your father?
Both parties.
Your mother's Jewish too?
Yeah. And my father found it necessary at time to dabble in Roman Catholicism. Since in St. Christ there was no Jewish synagogue, there was one in St. Thomas, and seeing a black person who was Jewish was an oddity. And as it's still even up to today, as a matter of fact, most European Jews denied there was such thing as black Jews at that time, and only since the Operation Moses last year did a handful of them admit there is such thing as black Jews. Not one of my teachers taught me anything about Africa, even the best of them.
Did your father teach you much about Africa and tell you much about?
Quite so. In discussion, my father would always, because of his own knowledge and because of being in the UNA, the Garvey movement, anytime I would speak about certain things, as a matter of fact, when Daddy spoke to me about the Torah or the Old Testament, he constantly pointed out to me that which is of Africa in it. For instance, Daddy would say, well, Moses, he was an African, he was born in Egypt. Long before, when people look at the map, and although they saw Egypt there, didn't recognize Egypt as being in Africa, my father had made that very clear to me. And my father gave me my first books on that, the Book of the Dead, and such books were knowledgeable to me at an early age because of my father.
How did you come to the States and when?
I came to the States in the Second World War.
Why?
Well, the boat was coming to the States.
Okay.
And I had a man who was supposed to be uncle. I said supposed because there's arguments. So this in my family life is kind of argumental as to who I am really in those contexts. And he and another man brought the numbers to America, Casper Hussein, he and Pompey. So I came to and spoke with him.
Where was this? What city?
Here in New York.
All right.
And
Harlem?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And I made my ground here for a while.
What year was that you came to New York?
I came in 1944, I think, 43, 44. Mm-hmm. And
right in the middle of things.
Right in the middle of the war. Yeah. And then I made some contacts. I had wanted to go to school here. I've always had a fascination to go to Columbia University, but they weren't taking people with my color in certain professions, certain disciplines.
Did they tell you right to your face?
Oh yes, there was no doubt. You had applications with a form, and you had to put your picture. And then they had many kinds. You had colored, Negro, and foreign. So you got to come from Africa and get into to study where you couldn't get it as a Negro or a colored. And they had different classes. If you were foreign black, you weren't a Negro or you weren't a colored. They had all kind of stupid classifications. And so, and then there were time foreign black, Negro, colored. You just couldn't get in, period, because that discipline, they didn't take black people or African people to study in that area.
What was this discipline you were trying to get into at Columbia?
Anthropology.
Anthropology.
Yes.
How did you become interested in that?
Well, for a number of reasons. The African movement for independence was going on even though there was a war.
In Harlem, it was very active.
In Harlem, in the Caribbean, some people in the Caribbean, and naturally in Europe and so forth. The Nnamdi Azikiwe's from Nigeria, the Kwame Nkrumahs and the Nyomboro, Awolowo. These are names that may not be familiar to some of the young fellows who follow African nationalism, but those are the big names at the time.
Well, I wanted to ask you, what was Harlem like when you arrived in those days?
Harlem was something. Harlem was Harlem. Today, Harlem is a shadow of itself. When I came on a Saturday afternoon, or a Saturday, 100 Lenox Avenue from 110th Street up to the river, I would say from 5 o'clock in the afternoon, about 90% of the people on the street, people sitting on the stoop because there were no air condition. And
when you say up to the river, you mean at 155th?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Harlem in that time, if you heard a person snatch a purse, people would speak for that about 2 weeks. People would be speaking about that. It was so rare. Harlem at that time, drug was maybe 1 or 2 musicians, maybe. It wasn't even a musician, it wasn't common. Sunday afternoon in Harlem, from on 7th Avenue down was Easter. Every Sunday was Easter.
You mean everybody had
Everybody dressed in their best. 8th Avenue, up 8th Avenue, Duke Ellington's Take the A Train was true. When you get up 145th Street, you get to the more influential, the better dressed, the better eaten with the Pocam's beans, of course, the cans and the thing. You had the man of Walkers, you had the man of Sinclair's, the Renaissance still going on, the Mom Lou's and Jenny and the Frasers for the restaurant. It was a time when still the Packards, the big time car was the Packard and Lafayette, where people all over the world came to Harlem to eat. You did not eat. I don't care about the war or nothing else. What was the name you call? You didn't eat unless you came to Harlem to eat.
Of all this excitement and stimulating activity in Harlem, what were you doing at the time?
Oh, I was studying.
Where?
Then I started...
on your own or
yes,
in school?
And in school. I had finished school a short period of time. I had gone to Cuba. Back there, got the master's degree in anthropology and the doctorate in anthropology. And then I'd come back to...
In other words, because you, excuse me, but because you couldn't get into Colombia, you went to Cuba to finish your education?
Right.
And you studied where in Cuba?
Universidad de Havana, the University of Havana.
Mm-hmm.
And
you stayed there and got your master's degree?
Yeah.
And then you came back to Harlem?
Not directly. I went back to Puerto Rico and then came back to Harlem.
I see.
And then I became very active in the Harlem scene, not in the direct political sense, because I became involved in the African freedom movement, the movement of the Nkrumahs, and the started by Dr.Ben, the Ethiopian World Federation. I became, because then I had these background from my father. I had a series of names that when I go to Ethiopia, I knew my family tree. I knew there were no family tree on my father's side, but 1 or 2 families that they said possibly were family. Those are La Valley, but really we couldn't tie it together. But I knew that if I had reached to Ethiopia, I'd be able to go because my father gave me names and people to go. So when I came here, I joined the movements that were dealing with Garveyism. That element of the UNIA that was still remaining. Some men from Antigua, a fellow named Brian from Barbados, and there was so many here at the time.
You never got to meet Dr. Marcus Garvey?
I met him in England eventually, luckily, when I went on to England to do the studies. But I met him at Albert Hall. He was giving a lecture there, and then he
Where
came
was Albert Hall?
in England, in London, and then at the Africa House there was then, and I think there still is, Africa House, and I met him one day. The day I met Garvey was the day I met heaven, because in the room was Nkrumah, Nandi Zukwe, Jomo Kenyatta, Garvey, Niromboro, Awawolo. They were having an all-Africa conference of the Africans who were in England at the time. I was a young man, comparatively at 68, I was still a young man then. And I was literally sitting at the feet of these giants. And I mean, I was spellbound. I don't think I winked my eyelid once or breathed more than a light murmur, because I was in a council of the gods and had the privilege of seeing all these great men all at once.
What kind of a man was Garvey?
Garvey was...
Was he warm or was he icy like Dr. Du Bois, you say?
No, but Garvey was a fight, I would say a hot plate for to cook on.
Serious all the time?
Serious, vibrant, and when he had no periods in his speech. He spoke like a machine, blah, 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 blah. You know, just like you hear him giving the lecture, that's the way he spoke. He had so much to say in so short a time to say. And then he had his experience here in jail, people who had deceived him, people who had framed him up, and all this kind of thing. People who he expected as his first lieutenant, who double-crossed him for little jobs for the federal government and all these kinds of things. And then he was there without a family. And so you see, an integrity that wasn't going to work for the colonial system, all of these kind of things. So I met him at that point. You could say the rage was deep. So I saw the fireball of a Garvey. Though dying, you could say, physically, still...
He was ill?
Yeah, he was ill. He was not himself. I didn't know him as a young man, of course, but I could see from the Garvey I heard of and the Garvey I met, we could see this was a dying Garvey. But still strong, still proud. And I could say, part of my pride about being an African could be attributed to Garvey also. Besides my father, I will say Garvey had a tremendous impact on my pride as an African person.
All right, so you left Prince Albert Hall, came back to the United States. That was just a visit to participate in that conference. What happened to your development back in Harlem?
Well, there were a number of people there. Dr. Hudgens. I didn't know John as much. I've met John a few times, John Clark, in the Schomburg collection, and he was struggling like myself and the others in history because nobody wanted to hear us. J.A. Rogers, and I don't know, Dr. Seifert. Harlem was just an emporium of African intellectual thought. And so I got into it. Richard B. Moore was there. You probably remember. He's passed on. These minds, and then the Richard Wrights and the others were also
So did you meet on a regular basis? Did you communicate? Did you exchange books and knowledge?
Yes, Richard Moore had every Sunday at 310 Lenox Avenue. I think it's now where the Mutual Building were.
That's where WLIB used to be.
That's right, right there. We would have Sunday afternoon and sometimes Saturday afternoon meetings. You want to hear something, Kid? We used to go down and pay people 25 cents to come up and listen. There were times we paid people to come up to the lectures.
To listen to?
To listen, hoping that it would start. I remember one time Philippa Schuyler was a little girl. She was a child prodigy of the piano. And everything, we used to sponsor her. She'd come and play the piano, and then the lectures would come, Richard and all those people. Eventually, I got a chance to do some lecturing, too. Yeah, that's where the West Indian Federation got its seeding. in those meetings. Richard Moore and Barnes and Domingo and Malliot. Malliot was on the Amsterdam News. Domingo, I think, also. These were men who started the struggle for the Federation. Malliot and Domingo for Jamaica, very heavy with Bustamante and Buster's brother.
You mean Manley? Norman Manley?
Norman Manley would come there. Adams from Barbados, and others.
They were always coming in and talking and lecturing.
Right there at the forum.
But Harlem didn't turn out en masse to listen to this.
Not to listen to those. Harlem turned out en masse for Randolph. A. Philip Randolph, the men for the Urban League, Walter White. NAACP Urban League was the big thing. Africa, nobody wanted to hear. Nobody wanted to be black. You see, everybody was colored and Negroes. They didn't know that Negro was a word that the Portuguese invented in the 16th and 17th century for us. They didn't know that colored didn't say, what color should a colored me color? And
so you're saying that the NAACP and the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters Union, they were talking about
integration. Getting a path to the action, even amalgamation. Walter White had come up with his nonsense about maybe, he said there's a joke later, maybe we should take an injection, some scientists to make an injection and tell all of us white. He never said tell all of us black, because white is that light, I don't think he want to go black. He didn't think of all of us coming black. Well, that was the trend of the time. To call a person an African was an insult, and most, not all people, of course, but the vast majority. The conch was the big thing, you know, putting the lie in your head and taking a comb and going fast, and then it comes straight and so forth, the zoot suit, and, you know. But there was the other element. There was strong force of the Seiferts, and the Seifert had an institute and many others speaking. There was a woman, Miss McBroom from Jamaica, who had a school on African history. There were a number of schools. Two or three of us started a school for African thought. And we had the school in Amsterdam Avenue by 125th Street there. So it was that element still stood there.
Was there a split among black people between those who were born in the States and those from the Caribbean?
Yes, if I want to be honest about it, it died out by a very common element. And I got to say it in a nice stage because I'm on TV, love making. The Caribbean man and woman and the Caribbean and the African-American man and woman amalgamated as was to be expected, and love solved it all. It's come back.
Not all of it, because
it's a little bunch of fools who will still continue fighting. And when we are Africans, I solved that in my sense by explaining to my children and others the boats, the slave boats. When the slave trade started, and the Pope Martin V of the Roman Catholic Church and Bishop Las Casas started the slave trade to the west. The boats didn't come from Africa to America. They came from Africa to the Caribbean, mainly Jamaica and Cuba. These were the Spanish thing. The first of the slaves came to Cuba and Jamaica, and then to Barbados and the other islands, as the others came into effect with it, the British and others. They were in the Caribbean from 1506. The first group of indentured workers didn't come to America until 1619 or 20 at Jamestown, Virginia. So I always tell people, what nonsense are you talking about? We are all African. They didn't bring West Indians, and not one West Indian I ever met, because Columbus, that fool, lost his way, and he thought he had found India. They brought people from the Caribbeans, African Caribbeans, and the first of them came from Barbados to Virginia, going on holiday to Boston, to England. Now, so far, it's 100 and odd years African people were in the Caribbean before they came here. It doesn't mean the first Africans came to North America then, because Estebanico with Cortes, little Esteban, came here and went to what is today New Mexico and so forth before the first European came here as a colonist. So I wasn't talking about them, but I'm talking about groups during and after the slave period of time. So all of us, the so-called Geechee is a good best example of it. The Geechee is the remaining merger of the two cultural African group in terms of linguistics, those from the Caribbean and those from here. Those who had developed here a southern kind of English from the ignorant European in the South, and those who had come from the Caribbean with a development of English, and the same thing. The colonialist European was an illiterate European. I would say the slap of Europe came to America, not the intellectual of Europe didn't come here. So that the African was brought into European culture, not by an intelligent European teacher, but a broken down debaucher of European culture. So that's why the African didn't get much of European culture. Otherwise, you would have seen from then that European culture is rooted strictly in African culture. The Greeks, the Ethiopian and Nubians taught, the Egyptians, Ethiopian Nubians taught and brought the Greeks into civilization.
When did you decide that you were going to focus on Egypt and become what you're now known as an Egyptologist? Is that relatively recent, or does that go back a ways?
No, I wrote my first book, We the Black Jews, in my last year of college in 1938, a pamphlet, and that was showing the origin of Judaism in Egypt.
What prompted you to do that?
Because...
Of your religion?
Partly, but mostly because people in Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands look at a black Jew and laugh. And I was trying to show them that Judaism didn't start in Europe. There was no European history when Judaism started. There were no Greeks, no Romans, no Etruscans. Abraham was in Africa, a place called Egypt. Egypt is always in Africa. Moses is born in Africa, and the pages of where Moses says the 10 Commandments, Moses didn't get any 10 Commandments at Mount Sinai. And then my father pointed out to me, Moses, they said, was a priest in Egypt. And Daddy showed me, if he was a priest in Egypt, it took 40 years to train a priest. He went into the priesthood at age 7, and he came out at 47. And in the place where he went, the mystery system, they had already been teaching the negative confession, 42 commandments, such as, I have not killed my father or my mother, I have not made like my bushel, I have not spoken ill of the gods, and so and so. They call it negative confession. You could see them in the tomb of Ramesses VI and other places.
And that's the basis of the 10 Commandments?
Right. And one and only God, Akhenaten, otherwise known as Amenhotep IV, Amenhotep IV, had already taught of a one and only God by the name of Aten. And Amenhotep died before Moses was born, and he was teaching about monotheism, and so on and so on and so on. The Jews talk about the God, the golden cow, the golden calf. And when you go to Africa, or to Egypt and Ethiopia, you see the picture of the golden calf as Goddess Het Heru, the West scholar Hathor, a cow with a disc between her arms, that was the golden calf that the Jews worship, an African woman.
So you got into Egyptology really to answer those who were saying that Egypt was
a European country, and it was this country, because then I found out that Egypt, like all the other places in Africa, North Africa in particular, was as African as Congo is today, or Munamatapa, which they call South Africa now. I find that the first non-African people to come into Egypt were the Hyksos in 1675. And subsequent to the Hyksos, the Assyrians, and the Hyksos in 1655, which were the 13th dynasty. By the way, that was the time when Abraham was born. That was the time when the Jews came, the Hebrews came into Egypt, because Jews is a misnomer. It's only one of the tribe. It's the Hebrew people, the Hebrew tribes, and Judah, the tribe, the warrior tribe, the tribe of the army, was only one of the many tribes. All right. And then after that came the Assyrian, the Ethiopian was ruling Egypt and the Nile at the time. Then came the Persians from Persia with Cambyses in 525, and subsequently the Greeks in 332, by then with Alexander, the son of Philip of Macedonia. And then in 47 came the Romans with Julius the Caesar, and so on and so on. Those amalgamating armies produced the half caste that you see predominantly, and then finally, of course, the Arabs and others.
All right. Where did you get all this information from, and how do you study?
Well, I then went to Egypt, and I went to do first an examination for myself. I hooked up with a team there that was teaching, but of course, when they make the fire, Egypt used to have the cobras was still common, and the alligator, not the alligator, crocodile was still common. It came back the other day. They found that there's some crocodiles since the dam. Well, the group, I was the only black person, and when they start the fire, they didn't let me come next to them. I was kept 50 feet at least from them, so sometime I was...
What fire? What do you do?
You had to fire when you're doing the field work in the field, you had a fire to keep the snakes and things away from you in the night. But I didn't get to the fire. I was black. My skin might have rubbed off on somebody. So I kept up, but I didn't care in the sense, don't mean that I like snakes. But I took the chance. Well, I started there and went to the tombs and temples. It is then I found out for sure that African people, black people, were getting a bill of goods. That they were lying to us in the Bible, they were lying to us in the textbooks, they were lying to us everywhere. And then I started to realize that men like Forstolnik James, Professor George James, and others were correct. I saw the statue of Ramesses II at Abu Simbel. That time they didn't move it up for the dam. I went and said to Tonkanon's statue. I went to Abydos and saw right in there, saw the story of the negative confession, of virgin birth, Isis getting pregnant by immaculate conception, giving birth of a child. I went to the island of Philae and saw the beginning of the story of a man who killed his brother, said Typhon, who killed his brother Osiris, and the revenge murder by Horus, the nebulous of Typhon at the temple at Edfu, long before the story of Cain and Abel. When I saw these things, and I saw the pyramids, and note that the pyramid didn't have a brick made of any material, much less mud brick made of straw. And then I noted, the records show that the pyramid, the last of the major pyramids at Giza, was in the 4th dynasty. And the first Jew, Abraham, wasn't born until the 13th dynasty. And then I started to question myself and my religious position. And I asked, how could this be that? And then I said, I looked in the Torah and noticed that nothing is said in the Torah about building the pyramid. That's folklore. It's nobody, for some reason, that rumor went on and on and on, that the Hebrew built the pyramid. Of the 72 pyramids, they're all before Hebrewism. And so I started to question.
All the pyramids were built before
birth of Abraham. And especially the ones that everybody go to, those at Giza. Those pyramids, the big one you see at Giza is by Khufu, which the Greeks call Cheops. Later, of course. Khafra, which is Khufu's son, which the Greeks call, they call it Shephren. And the other one, I suppose, just have to slip me, Menkaure, whom the Greeks call Mycerinus. Those 3 pyramids are in the 4th dynasty, 2000 and at BC. Abraham's birth is until 1600 and at BC. You know, we talk about the time is going the reverse way. The one at Saqqara by the architect and multi-genius Imhotep is 2785 BC. 1,008 years before the birth of Abraham.
So when you saw all this information, you decided to do what with it?
I decided that somehow I got to get it to the African community in the Western Hemisphere. At that early stage in my, I got to get it to become more popular, to be in the African church. And then by that time, there were African synagogues, Rabbi Matthews and a number of other. I had to get this information into Rabbi Matthews. It was never respected. Rabbi Block and a few other white rabbis given some recognition, but by and large, it was never recognized.
So you came back and you began to lecture?
I came and began to lecture free. Never charged for my lectures.
Where would you lecture?
Well, sometimes I get a chance in the Y, the theater in the Y, or Brother Moore in his Harlem Forum, in some schools, in some private organizations that will invite me. A few black teachers, African-American teachers who had integrity of their pride in their blackness and in their Africanness, they would invite me and so on.
When did you decide to publish?
I decided to publish because I found that the written word goes much farther than the spoken words, at least in those days. There wasn't the tape recorders and so forth. It was your voice and that's it. And when you spoke, only a handful hear you. But if you wrote, the book travels, one book may go in the hand of 50 different people, whereas, and umpteen books, you know, you multiply by those 50. And so I decided that I had to publish. I didn't have the means to publish. I didn't have the expertise of the editors and so forth.
Wait, couldn't you find a publisher?
No, you couldn't find a white publisher who wanted to publish something in Africa from an African point of view.
You approached them?
I approached almost everyone, McKay, McGraw-Hill, and Schuster, and you name it. I approached them, I went, and I had such excuse as too much documentation.
Too much documentation.
Too much. I had one time some pages with nothing but documentation. It was too much. One person tell me, why you want to, all the way back there, the term reverse racism, why you want, for instance, I show pictures of Jesus being black, of black popes, the 3 black popes of the Catholic Church. I show the African emperors of Rome, Honorius, Septimus Severus, and Caracalla. All those things, the publishers didn't want out, and then they sent me sometime to the advisors, the consultant. And of course, these are the same consultant work I got to refute. And
Honorius had black skin?
Oh no, black as a tar baby. Yes, and Augustine, St. Augustine was from Numidia. You see pictures of Augustine and things in some of these places. They're big lies, frauds. Augustine, who had the picture of Augustine? Augustine tell you who he was in the confession. And it's just...
What did he say in the confessions?
He spoke
described himself?
Yes, and spoke of him being a Mantian of Numidia. And you know who the Mantians were? They were like Ace of Spades, and Hippias described them as the darkest thing on earth.
So when you couldn't get a publisher, what'd you do?
I went literally, and they had pawn shops in Harlem then. The drugs wasn't so big, and you could get sell this thing in the. I went to a pawn shop, literally, pawned some of my clothes to add to the little money I had, and I published the first book in the United States. Was Black Man of the Nile, a little paper, not the third. This is the third edition now, but the first edition was 200 or 300 pages, a little cheap paper. I did it on a mechanical Olympus typewriter, and I bang out the pages and get it the best I could. I write it, edit it, did the correction, did everything, did the artwork, like I still do in all of my books, and got a copy. I didn't know where to carry it after it was printed. Where I going to store it? I store some of them by my bed, some of the kitchen table, and so forth. And one day, Mr. Mishaw had his bookstore. And I went to him and I said, would you sell this book for me? He says, who are you? And I said, probably not much, but I am an author. And he says, and I describe, I was teaching then at that time, part-time at Teachers College, a course under Dr. Ralph Linton. The course was handled by Dr. Tewksbury and Dr. Combe and myself. It was called Education 500. So I explained to him, he says, that's not enough. I said, well, I speak on the corner with the brothers sometime. I lecture at night, history and so on. He said, you're the fellow. I said, yeah. He said, let me see the book. So I gave him, he says, oh, that's good, about African people. Oh, man, look at this, these dates and all the pharaohs listed. And he said, man, he said, this must be good. So he said, give me 3. So I gave him the 3 books. Before I got through the door, some people in there said, let me see the book. And one man said, how much is it? And I said, $2. He said, $2 for this? So I thought that the man was complaining about the price. I said, well, I could make, he says, no, I'm not complaining, it should be $5. So the man gave me $5. And then Michelle put the price to $5, so the other 2 bought it. So Michelle said, bring a box. So I went up to the house and brought a box, and by the time I was out, the half box went, Miss Brown was there selling at the time. So Michelle said, wait, bring 2 boxes more. And it's so that the book started, and I started mailing out the books, and the word of mouth. I couldn't advertise. I didn't have a distributor. I still don't have a distributor.
And by word of mouth, the book became very popular.
To the United States until the 3rd edition. Another thing now goes to Japan, and even Liechtenstein buy books from me, and universities almost everywhere, all Alaska, go to the Caribbean, and the motherland, of course, Africa.
How many books have you published?
To date, about, I think the last count was 29. I think 29, and some pamphlets will be 32.
Mm-hmm. And the prime focus is Africa?
The main focus, yes, this sole focus is Africa and African people.
More specifically, North Africa?
Yes.
Egypt?
North Africa and down, especially down the Nile, the valley of the Nile. And that concentration is due to that's the area where man's civilization started. Even there was no Samaria yet. There was no Babylonia or anything like that. The Chinese had not produced a single book yet. And those people, the ancient Egyptians themselves, the ancient Africans, stated in the Papyrus of Nefer, and I quote, we came from the beginning of the Nile, where God, happy, H-A-P-I, dwells, at the foothill of the mountain of the moon, unquote. The beginning of the Nile is 2 places. You got Uganda, the Blue Nile, Ethiopia, Uganda, the White Nile, Ethiopia, the Blue Nile. The mountain of the moon, you have 2 in Africa. One is called Kilimanjaro, between Kenya and Tanganyika, and the other one is called Rwenzori. And the Twa and the Hutu, the small people, which people call pygmy, ugly term, those people you can find even in South Africa today as the Kalahari and the Kalahari and the Khoikhoi. The European willfully distort the name and call them Hottentots and some other name has been. But you can find those people in Egyptian history also as the Sibenetos and the Sinabs. They were the early people that brought down even a symbol today, the Ankh, which Christians are now using in America, and by the time Tutankhamun exhibit come here and don't know they are using what they once called a pagan object.
And so you decided that even though you weren't able to get a publisher, you were going to publish this out of your own pocket.
I did.
Have you made much money off of your books?
I have lost money consistently and still do.
Why do you do it then?
Well, Gil, suppose I had a yacht in the basin by 76nd Street, a condominium for $140,000 and a Mercedes-Benz or Lamborghini, not calling them down. Does that make me a man? Won't I still be called by the least educated European a nigger? Won't I be still called inferior, uneducated, welfare client? Won't I, with all that money? But
What then makes you a man?
my integrity, the knowledge of myself. You see, what they call me matters not. I go in the poorest of restaurant in Harlem and sit there in the morning, and I am a proud man, no less proud than sitting here, the Wall of Astoria, in Regan living room. I am a man. And I'm a man because I know I am a man. I saw the evidence that I'm a man because I know where man's origin of civilization came from, because I have seen it, dealt with the documents, taken the pictures, got the slides, all this, and I am a man like any other man. And that's why I can decide that no other man I respect any more than myself.
But you've also lately gotten involved with taking guided tours, conducting guided tours to Africa, the Nile.
Yes.
How did that develop?
I had taken individuals over the last umpteen years. And about 1978, Dr. Richard King of California, a psychiatrist, Dr. King said to me, Dr. Ben, you've taken one or two people to Egypt to study and so forth. Why don't you take groups? I said, man, I don't have the time, and you have to need a travel agency and all that. He said, no, well, let's just see what we could do. And he went and organized a group in Watts, the Fanon group, from the Fanon Center. And he said, would you lead us to the Nile? I said, sure. And so in 1976 or 78, the Fanon Center made a tour, educational tour to Somalia, Kenya, and Egypt. Some went there. And I led that group down the Nile because I begin my trip at the southern part of Egypt down to the center, because the Nile flow south to north, not north to south, and the civilization came down the Nile. And then so I started, but I let them know I will not take anybody to any part of Africa, and especially the Nile, for a vacation, for tourism. You have to sign up and agree that it's going to be an educational tour. Now, in the afternoon, when you finish, you could go and do what you want. You could buy the whole of Egypt. You could play around. But you're going to sign up to take that tour, and you got to go out in the field and take that tour unless you're sick.
And you lecture on the site.
I lecture on the site, and I lecture 1 hour in the hotel in the room, and there's a question and answer period about the history of what you have seen. Again, if you came, it would transform your life. It can't help it. You see, I say, it's going to transform your life either negatively, positively, but you will not be the same. You can't come there and see all these things, invalidating some of the myths you were taught, validating the integrity of yourself. And since I carry African people like any other group, there's some people, it is my people need education. And when you go there and see Ramesses II, and see the Sphinx of Giza, which is the statue of God Hamakis, and also the statue of Pharaoh Khafra, you see what your people have done down through the years, and find the lies you were told in schools, synagogues, mosques, and all these different things. See the story of the Immaculate Conception 4,000 years before Mary and Jesus, and see all these things in front of your face. It transforms your life.
Welcome to Like It Is. On December 16th of last year, Professor Yosef Ben-Jochannan appeared on Like It Is and spoke essentially on the need for African Americans to have more cohesion, and gave in an example the role that the bar mitzvah plays in building a strong sense of Jewishness. Dr. Ben suggested that blacks might do well to build such a ritual into our religion. On January 17th, the Anti-Defamation League wrote me a letter complaining about that segment of the program in particular. And let me read you a portion of that letter. Vis-a-vis the segment with Dr. Ben, his initial comments seemed to be dealing with the importance of self-identity, religiously and otherwise, for blacks. It was you who insisted upon directing the interview towards comments about Jews, and in our judgment, your inquiry about bar mitzvah came completely out of left field. Dr. Ben's response to your question was unadulterated drivel. Your follow-up query, quote, he makes a declaration of commitment to his people which transcends being an American, unquote, was outrageous. It only encouraged Dr. Ben to make an accusation of dual loyalty a favorite piece of rhetoric in the arsenal of the anti-Semite. Dr. Ben was made credible by being on your show, and in the total absence of any challenge by you, could well lead your listeners to assume that this person is knowledgeable about Judaism and about Jews, and that his statements should be and are acceptable. We find this deplorable. Given that we have had several differences with your program previously, we do not anticipate receptivity to the concerns stated above. That's portions of the letter. Well, I answered Carol Lister, who wrote that letter. She's regional director of the ADL, by inviting her to appear on Like It Is to confront Dr. Ben. Well, the ADL has accepted, and so has Dr. Ben. We'll get things right underway in a moment. Professor Yosef Ben-Jochannan, or Dr. Ben as he is popularly known, is an Egyptologist, the author of innumerable books on African history and Egyptology, and has taught for several years at Cornell University. Rabbi Arthur Seltzer is director of the Long Island Regional Office of the Anti-Defamation League and resides in Great Neck, Long Island. Welcome to Like It Is.
Thank you.
Maybe we can start with you, Rabbi Seltzer. Did you see the program?
No, I did not see the program, but I have studied the transcripts.
Okay. How did you come to this chair today? How did that happen, since you didn't see the program? You were called by the New York office of the ADL and made aware of the program?
Yes, Carol Lister, who originally wrote to you, very much wanted to appear, but because of a conflict of schedule,
yes,
she asked if I would assume the responsibility of responding in the name of ADL.
All right.
And that's what brings me here.
And she sent you the transcript?
Yes, indeed.
All right. What are your problems with the comments that were made by Dr. Ben in the program?
From the perspective of the ADL, we have numerous difficulties with the statements that were made, and I suspect we'll have an opportunity as the program goes on to discuss specifics. But in an overall general sense, as we study the transcript, Dr. Ben's remarks were full of clearly factual errors, but the kind of errors which were not just matters of detail, but were matters that would lead one down the path of the charge of dual loyalty, which, as Carol Lister indicated in her letter, has been a classic charge of the anti-Semite throughout the generations. The statement that appears in the transcript that was made by Dr. Ben, that a Jewish child makes a statement of allegiance to Israel, and makes a statement of allegiance greater than even to his Americanism, is so patently false and outrageous as to make one wonder why such a statement would be made. I must tell you that before joining the staff of the Anti-Defamation League, I served as a congregational pulpit rabbi for 9 years and officiated at countless numbers of bar and bat mitzvahs in my congregations. And I must tell you that never have I heard a more inaccurate statement as to what goes on. The transcript indicates that a Jewish child commits himself that there shall never be another Holocaust, takes upon himself political obligations, takes upon himself the responsibility to fight for the state of Israel. The reality is that in the Jewish tradition, bar mitzvah means a son of the commandments. And a boy becomes a bar mitzvah, a son of the commandments, upon his 13th birthday. A girl, in America, the practice tends to be at 12. According to Talmudic law, she reaches her majority at 12 and a half. The bar mitzvah ceremony most specifically indicates that a Jewish child, a minor, now has reached that stage in life where he is considered an adult Jew in terms of his religious and communal responsibilities. Any statements that are made of commitment by bar and bat mitzvah children or adults as they enter the adult world in the Jewish community are statements of acceptance of the yoke of the commandments, of all that comes with Jewish life, personal, family, communal, and under no circumstances are there statements of political content. But if I could perhaps clarify this a bit more, Dr.Ben then indicated in the transcript, as it appears, that this very statement of loyalty that's made to the state of Israel is the seedbed out of which comes the charge of dual loyalties. And we ask ourselves in the Anti-Defamation League the following question: why would anyone offer such a blatantly false and frankly perverse statement of what it means for a Jewish community to celebrate a religious ceremony of passage? The answer, we might suggest, is the next sentence, which indicates the charge of dual loyalties. This statement was made many, many times throughout the entire transcript. It led in one of his remarks to a statement in discussing about Israel that now we understand about the genocide of the Hebrews as they entered the land. The commitment of a Jewish child to fight for Israel reflects the genocidal entrance of the children of Israel into the land in biblical times. Not only does that have a distinctly political ring to it, it is again an unacceptable statement, if only from the point of view of biblical scholarship, which very clearly has come to understand that those sections that speak of a victorious march of an army of onslaught into the land are certainly later sections of the text edited as kind of national poetry. But if one reads the second book of Samuel in the Bible, one reads very clearly a different version of the immigration of tribes slowly into the land, the entrance into the land, the settlement with other peoples. And indeed, a close reading of the text will indicate that even during the times of King David and King Solomon, and after, many non-Hebrews lived side by side with the Hebrews in the land. In effect, there was no such genocide. There was no such destruction. And to even raise the thought that a Jewish child indicates his loyalty to the Jewish people in the context of that historical statement, and it's applied in terms of the Jewish present, is something that, frankly, insulting is, I think, an apt word as far as we understand it. If I may just add one other part to this. The transcript would indicate that Dr. Ben, in his concern for the need in the black community for cultural and ideological structures and unity, which is obviously a laudable and praiseworthy goal, then proceeds to redefine Jewish history and biblical history in a way which may be conducive to his political view, but does violence to history. He refers to Judaism as originating in Africa, that all of Judaism comes from Africa. The reality of the biblical text, one must merely open it to read, is that Abraham comes from Mesopotamia. He comes from the area which we today refer to as the Fertile Crescent. Indeed, what we refer today as Judaism, the religion of the Jewish people, reached its full maturity not in Egypt, but according to many scholars, after the first exile in 586 BCE back into Mesopotamia. The need to rewrite history of other people in order to create a cultural superstructure for oneself does neither justice to the one whose history is being rewritten, nor the one who pursues the worthy goal of cultural structures. And therefore, to tie it up, we find most disturbing the factual mistakes that are replete in this transcript, but of more compelling concern, the ultimate dual loyalty, genocidal, militaristic implications of the statement.
Genocidal, you say?
In the reference to the biblical genocide, so it appears in the transcript, that is the term that's used, of the children of Israel as they entered the land. I would certainly not subscribe to such a term. The very fact that it does appear attributed to Dr. Ben in the text, we find to be absolutely, again, insulting and unacceptable.
Right. Dr. Ben, what is your response?
By the way, I have to let the rabbi know I'm much as a Jew as he is. Born of a Jewish mother, a Yemenite grandmother, a Yemenite Puerto Rican mother, Ethiopian Hebrew father, Beta Israel, by the way they call us Falasha for whatever their reasons. Thus I am as much a Jew as the rabbi or the grand rabbi in Israel, any of the grand rabbis in Israel. Is the rabbi stating here that in the book of Genesis there is no mention of the extermination, and I use the word genocide, of the 7 tribes of the Amalekites, the Hittites, the Moabites, the Jebusites? He in his own statement stated that this is ameliorated somewhat in the book of Samuel. Everybody saw that. But the book of Samuel doesn't change the book of Genesis. And we remember that Genesis wasn't written first. It was Exodus. It's at the Council of Jamia that they decided to write Genesis. Next, since there is no Jewish race, you know, you have Indian Jews from India, from Kashim Jews, look like any Indian. You have ourselves from Ethiopia. By the way, the rabbi wouldn't forget that it says Moses married the daughter of the high priest of Ethiopia, or Cush. Being a rabbi, he will know this. Second, moreover, about the bar mitzvah, and I went through one like the rabbi went through one at around the same period of time, is the rabbi saying that the bar mitzvah is not a commitment to the people? Isn't the Torah demanding? And I am talking about the Talmud. Talmud is not Torah. The Torah is supposed to have been written by God or passed down, although it was in fact written at the Sanhedrin. The theory, the mythology, the allegories that it's written by God or passed down by Moses, again, is a myth. That's Jewish mythology, because Moses is dead in around 1196 before the Christian era, whereas the Sanhedrin doesn't release a thing called the Torah until about 700 before the Christian era, which was written from 700 before the Christian era to 500. It took 200 years. There's a commitment in anybody, that any child that's been bar mitzvah, and when you're talking about circumcision of women, that is strictly Western, and it has nothing to do with orthodoxy. Using the word orthodoxy to mean something. There's never been a circumcision. It can't be a circumcision of girls. But anyhow, let us continue. The point is that in the bar mitzvah, it commits the boy. If you commit yourself to the community, there's a call to return to Israel. There's a call that every child, I went through it, that you must come back to Israel. If that isn't a fact, the rabbi can say what he wants. His position of, or the ADL, position of fear of this, then let's look at the behavior. It's just like saying today, you know, one time the rabbi, I don't know personally, but the ADL and all the other Jewish organizations, one time didn't even recognize that we exist as falashas. It is something in America. American Jews have decided that they're going to speak for all Jews. And not only for all Jews, you remember they said blacks and Jews. I'm black and Jewish. You're white and Jewish. You're European. You're of European Jewish ancestry. I'm African Jewish ancestry. No more claim to Israel than I have, because there's no Jewish race. Okay, let me continue.
The rabbi forget, he says that Abraham, he points to Judaism coming from Abraham. Then I said that the rabbi obviously have not read the 10 Commandments and their source. Moses is not until about 1346 before the Christian era, 49 years after the death of Amenhotep IV, otherwise known as Akhenaten. Every one of those 12 so-called commandments, and that Moses is supposed to have gotten at Mount Sinai. By the way, Mount Sinai is still in Egypt, in Africa, hasn't gone any place. Now, those 10 commandments weren't gotten by Moses. Because I'm Jewish don't mean that I have to follow the mythology. When you go in any of the major tombs in Egypt, you find those 10 commandments plus 32 more, otherwise referred to as the negative confession. Am I to believe that Moses was born in Mizraim, Egypt, about 1346 before the Christian era, went to school there, become a priest, at age 85 or around there, decided that somebody mistreated his people, and that in every school in Egypt, you had to recite the negative confession, 42 laws, of which they said, I have not killed man or woman, I have not stolen this, I have not, every one of the so-called 10 commandments is already stated that Moses didn't see it. I would like the rabbi to tell me, where does it show that Abraham taught any of this? I would like the rabbi to tell me, before circumcision in Egypt, where did the Jews have circumcision? They said that Abraham's circumcision is part of what made him Jewish. Then the rabbi must tell me, the worship of the golden calf, which they call the golden calf, isn't that the worship of Hathor, the goddess Hathor? We could go on down.
Well, before we go on, Dr. Ben, let me just intrude. We do need to take a commercial break. We'll pause for breath, and we'll return right after this. Criticisms, Dr. Ben, that was voiced by Rabbi Seltzer is that you suggested that there is a political overtone in the ritual bar mitzvah, and he objects to this. Can you substantiate your statement?
Gil, if you went to any bar mitzvah, there's a lecture after the young man and before the young man. There's a lecture of the young man's commitment. It is a lecture in my commitment. Every child, if the rabbi is sitting here and tell me that the rabbi doesn't get up and get a lecture about the bar mitzvah, and the youngster doesn't pick out a section of the Torah to read, and that the youngster doesn't get up there and make a commitment to the Jewish community, then I don't know what form of Judaism. I don't know if he's Reform, Reconstructionist, Conservative, or Orthodox, or whatever else there may be. But it will be rare to me not to go to a bar mitzvah and not hear the rabbi mentioning the commitment to the Jewish people and to Israel. If, in fact, that rabbi is, unless the rabbi is anti-Israel.
All right.
Yes, I think there are a number of things that must be made clear, and the level of misstatements in this are also quite clear. You just repeated, as appeared in the transcript, the statement that the bar mitzvah boy picks out his selection for the morning. But it's rather common knowledge and Jewish practice of centuries that there is a set cycle of the reading of the Torah and the Haftorah, and bar mitzvah children under no circumstances are in a position to pick and choose their Torah portions. Their portions are part of the set calendar prescription of which portions of the Torah progressively are to be read on a given Shabbat, a Saturday morning, so that even on this factual level, there's a disturbing lack of accuracy in your presentation.
Wait, European Jews don't run Judaism. You don't make Judaism. Among the Falashas, among the Jews from Kashim Jews, we pick. You see, Judaism will run by you. You don't set the standard for Judaism.
So now we're in the process of a double standard of selection. You have indicated in your transcript that this is what occurs in American synagogues.
It does too.
By indicating that Jewish children make this statement of loyalty to Israel. Yet when I clarify your misstatement about how Torah readings are selected, you tell me, well, there are other practices aside from the practice here, which may indeed be true, one example being the triennial cycle of the reading of the Torah.
All right.
But then you can't take the American example and then selectively learn from it something that you choose from another context.
The Jewish child doesn't read the entire sermon of the period. He does select a section within that period. That's all I said. The child doesn't read the entire book or the entire thing that is going to be said on that particular Shabbat. The child has a section within it he reads.
And there are indeed many synagogues, especially in the Orthodox community, in which the entire section is indeed the entire parsha.
So then you're admitting that there is divergence between the Jewish synagogue right here in America?
Within the prescripted calendar structure of readings.
All I said is that the child is allowed to pick out. You're saying in the Orthodox, in certain Orthodox, not all, the child must read the entire thing. I'm saying that the child is allowed to pick out a section. What is wrong with that?
According to your transcript, and I won't take the time to find the exact words unless it's required, you make a statement that the child may pick out sections and you use the term Isaiah or from whatever.
Depending on the period of time in which we are.
Depending if Isaiah is indeed part of the text.
Who said not? I mean, you just brought in other words, I said exactly what you're saying, that the child is allowed to pick out that section. Let's say that we're reading the book of Isaiah now, or we're reading the book of Hosea. The child is allowed to pick out of Isaiah a certain section, or the child is allowed in Hosea if we are reading at that particular time, because all the children don't make bar mitzvah in the same month and at the same time.
One should be clear, however, that that's partially accurate, because part liturgically of what a child is expected to read or participate in, if possible, is the reading from the Torah itself. Indeed, the reading from the Haftorah is a significantly later development, precisely because if a child is a bar mitzvah, is a son of the commandments, then one of his first public possible acts is being called up to the public reading of the Torah.
Right.
And it's by this act that his reaching adulthood is publicly declared. If I may, however, go on to what I think.
Wait, let's settle this before we move on, and then I'll be happy to let you...
because there were some other points that I think should be
we're going to try to get into all
mentioned.
of that. Your response, Dr. Ben.
The point is, everyone, I stated, is adulthood. The question is not when does he do this, if he's a man or a child, because assume, I already stated, the Torah would be similar in essence to the confirmation of the Christians. When the child comes of a certain age and take up his manhood, in order to be able to sit in the minyan, to sit in the official congregation as a young man, he has to come and go for the bar mitzvah before he could sit in the minyan. You know.
Okay.
Now, he doesn't deny that. All I'm saying, and which he can't refute, he's saying about later changes. I don't care what the changes, if it's later or earlier. The fact is that they do it.
There's a very curious kind of contextual oversimplification here. On the one hand, Dr. Ben correctly points out certain instances of Egyptian historical input in what we today call the religion of the Hebrews and later Judaism. And no one can deny the role of cultural and historical context. On the other hand, given it would seem your political need to view all through the African perspective, you completely ignore the experience of the Code of Hammurabi, of the Mesopotamian sources of law, which appear significantly modified in later Torah development. What I'm suggesting is that, on the one hand, it is a strange scholarly position to argue that historical context must be accounted for in the development of Judaism, which I would accept, and then argue, however, that only that political context which is useful to your present political view is to be noted and is acceptable. As I read the transcript, as I read the transcript here, there is a comment here that says, and permit me to paraphrase loosely, that Judaism and all of Judaism and the Jewish people come from Egypt, therefore they are African, and therefore there is a statement later on that many blacks do not understand that they are indeed Jews. Now that raises to us a very curious question: why the constant need to inject a racial quota into a diverse historical context which we would acknowledge, but yet on the other hand, as we sit here having watched Operation Moses, and the ingathering of Ethiopian Jews into Israel, why then the need to define by race as what is essentially authentic in Judaism strikes us as a contradiction that at least can possibly be interpreted in terms of current political context, but certainly not by history.
All right,
Dr. Ben. I'm glad that you brought that last point, so I work from the last forward or backwards. Isn't it strange that just yesterday that the Jews in America found out that they are black Jews? Isn't it strange also that you don't consider us Jews, because when we go to Israel, you're still demanding that we must, quote unquote, reconvert. Who said we converted in the first place? Who said, what right have European Jews, who don't belong there either, have a right to tell us and to carry us through a shameful...
I'm sorry, European Jews who what?
No,
who don't have a...
any more than we do. Okay. Because the Russian Jews come there, many of them not circumcised, many of them never have a bar mitzvah, and we had to go, nobody asked them to reconvert. We had to go there, and a farce called circumcision, and the, you know, I wanted to use the Hebrew word, but at the moment. And we're supposed to go through all that. Next thing, Rabbi, how come my uncle, Tamarat Emanuel, came here in 1935 to raise money when Italy invaded Ethiopia? We were 5 million. When we left, we were 50,000. The Jewish community in America refused, denied that we existed. Up to now in Israel, you have 2 grand rabbis at least. The Sephardic Grand Rabbi and the Ashkenazi Grand Rabbi, the European Grand Rabbi, that refused to recognize that we're even Jews. Only the Sephardic Grand Rabbi started with Obadiah Yosef when he was the chief rabbi. Now let's go back. So that it's a farce about Israel telling us to come there for whatever the reason. In that, Israel to this day, from 1947, have in the Knesset a petition for the acceptance of Jews from Ethiopia, the right to return. To this day, it has not been approved. It has still been tabled every year. Now, so that you try to show the liberality of white American Jews when it doesn't exist. It doesn't exist at all. Because if you're saying that you're bringing us back, then we should go back as Jews, not as something that you're going to make us over there. Who gives you the authority to say who is a Jew and who isn't a Jew? You talk about my desire for the political aristocracy, my political sense. Well, it was obvious that no one questions European Jews. Am I to believe that European Jews don't have a white politics here? When blacks move into a Jewish neighborhood, white Jewish neighborhood, doesn't the white Jew move like the white Christian? I mean, doesn't the white Jew have white flight to the suburb? Now, so as a Jew, are you saying that I should behave as a Jew, period, in the United States, that means white Jew, in the United States, and run from the blacks? And when I come here, my acceptance in Judaism isn't the same as when you come. When you come, if you came as a white Jew, and the white Jews, and you deal with whites. Now, I'm a black Jew, isolated from Judaism by virtue of that, because of my blackness. When I go into a synagogue, most synagogue I go into, the first thing they tell me, and I have to say I'm Jew, when you become Jew, did your parents convert? When? You don't ask a white person walk into the synagogue and say that. Go back about the Jews learning the Hammurabi Code. When you talk about Hammurabi Code, you're talking about 2000 BC, just the other day, historically speaking. The concept of one God didn't come from Moses nor Hammurabi. Akhenaten preached one God before Moses was born. The Aaron and about their being African. If you're born in America, you are an American Jew, wouldn't you say? Now, where was Aaron born? Where was Moses born? And Sarah, Aaron's sister, and all of them, Miriam. Where were all of this supposed to be happening? Before the Jews come in contact again as a group. Not Moses, not Abraham alone and his little family. From Abraham and excluding Joseph. From then on, according to Torah, for approximately 400 years, everything the Jews learned was in Egypt. Everything. Because from the time of Joseph, Genesis ends, and Moses died. And there came a time when Joseph died. because of this bad Pharaoh that came, who knew not Joseph. From then on, we are to hear about the plight of the Jewish people and so forth. But before that, from the time of Potiphar, all the way down to the Exodus, isn't it everything the Jew learned was in there? It was no Hammurabi code. And I says the basic foundation of Judaism, one God and all that, came out of Africa. Egypt is still there, not in the Middle East.
Time for another break. We will continue with our discussion, our modest discussion, right after this. Let's press on.
Let's, please. A number of points. Again, we're into this historical selectivity, and at the risk of sounding as if I'm pushing Mesopotamia today, the reality is, of course, that both the archaeological and the literary evidence of such areas as Ebla and others clearly illustrate that a proto-monotheism existed in the Mesopotamian area centuries and centuries before the Hebrews. Some scholars have even attempted to identify one of the Mesopotamian names of this god as Eloah, and in that way tried to learn from it the Hebrew term Elohim. And I merely identify this as one scholarly view. Again, I wouldn't want to deny for a moment that Egypt was part of the cultural mix, and therefore Africa, as you would want to make the political point. But to selectively ignore all other historical factors to then be able to make a political point is not to be dismissed as a cry of anti-Semitism when it's raised, but is to be called for inaccuracy in the historical record. And one has an absolute right to do that when that inaccuracy then feeds it to contemporary politics. But if I would but if I could respond to the Ethiopian issue.
No, wait, no, I got to answer you that point first. Then you could go to the Ethiopian issue, because that's a big issue too. You try to throw over that anti-Semitism slip in right there. Even when a Jew disagrees with a Jew, it becomes anti-Semitic. By the way, I hope that you would agree that the common statement in America among Jews is that if your mother is Jewish, then you're Jewish. Would you agree to that?
According to Jewish law,
okay. And if I make it better, if your father is Jewish and your mother is Jewish, then you're ultra Jewish.
Excuse me, one's father has nothing to do with the status of Jewish law.
I added that for extra measure.
Right, but that has no
I didn't say it does. I didn't say it does. Don't be picayune. I mean, we're dealing with the issue. I said, well, okay, my mother is, and so that makes me yes. That makes me.
That. Yes.
Okay, fine. So then to call me anti-Semitic as a Jew practicing, went through all the rituals like the lady who probably did on yourself, then it would mean that I strongly disagree with the teachings that what you just stated, for example. Then I said to you, using the Torah itself, on the statement of the Torah that Abraham came from the city of Ur in the nation of Chaldea, which was at the time, since we're using by history, ruled by Africans, a joint army that went all the way to India. Now you said scholars. There's only one scholar that made that remark that I know of, and that's the one from the Stern Institute over there in Lexington Avenue. Now, secondly, there may be continuation of those scholars coming out of European context. What you fail to understand, Rabbi, is that European Jews are Europeans and think as Europeans and act as Europeans. African Jews, on the other hand, are being asked not to act as Africans and an African Jewish scholar, African scholarship. And thus you're telling me with the scholars. Now let me go.
All right, are you finished addressing his
No, the
point?
last part of his point.
You got more? All right.
Last part of his point. The period of time in which we're speaking, and unfortunately Torah doesn't give dates, but the period of time in which we're talking about Avram or Abraham isn't born until around 1775 BCE, before the Christian era. That would put him around the 13th century, 13th dynasty, Egyptian 13th dynasty, Ethiopian 13th, the dynasty of the Nile Valley as a whole, because it's not only Egypt. Egypt is the zenith of a culture that goes way back, because the ancient Egyptians themselves said we came from the beginning of the Nile where God happily dwelled. All of those things. For instance, look, Rabbi, the myth that the Jews built the pyramids. You know that's a myth. Yet it's taught, probably you say it yourself, Koch gets up there and he goes and stands up on the pyramid, Begin gets it up there, and you know pretty well that the last pyramid was built before the birth of the first Jew, Abraham. Now, if I say that, I'll be anti-Semitic.
All right. In the interest of fairness, Dr. Ben, let's hear what Rabbi Seltzer has to say.
What's disturbing is simply the level of misunderstanding of what we're saying is that the scholarly view that I identified and which you then identified as a Stern College view. Stern College is part of Yeshiva University, right, an Orthodox institution. My background is in the Reform movement. I assure you that much of what I've suggested in terms of biblical scholarship would be totally rejected and considered unacceptable by the Orthodox community.
I know that.
As representing non-rabbinic analysis of Torah. Therefore, to dismiss my remarks as being represented by Stern College raises the question of what kind of comprehension we have here of scholarship and indeed the pluralism within the Jewish community. And that leads me to the point I want to make.
Good point.
In the transcripts and in your remarks now, there's a tendency to speak of all Jews in the broadest context, so that you began with the Ethiopian issue by speaking about Israelis, then switched to white American Jews, and as I listened to you, I heard a constant tendency to put everything in the category of white, European versus black, Sephardic, Oriental. And again, I ask myself...
That's the way it is.
And again, I ask myself the question, the state of Israel, which has a population today which is 60% Sephardic,
right,
non-European...
Who are at the bottom of the social ladder.
Excuse, please, I listen to you. Which a population which is 60% non-European, a population coming from the Middle East and the Oriental countries, it is certainly a political charge, which we hear constantly and is used constantly, that Israel is a white European colonialist bastion in the middle of an Arab third world part of the world. But the reality is that Israel today increasingly takes on the Levantine quality of the area in which it's in, precisely because of the population. Side point, but let me proceed.
But let me point, and don't want me to answer
let
it.
Me
and then,
proceed,
no, let me answer that, and then you proceed.
No, sir.
No, wait. Now you don't run the program.
Can
I answer him?
No.
Let me interject. Let me interject. Let me give you 1 minute to press your point forward, and then Dr. Ben can... I must say that the time is evaporating.
Fine.
And that is my concern.
So then it's necessary to proceed.
1 minute.
Well, I shall try it 1 minute. Again, this attempt to say that only black Jews experience difficulty in Israel. There are a number of, frankly, inaccuracies in this. When Soviet Jews began to come to Israel, there was precisely the same kind of questioning raised by the rabbinate. Since the rabbinic establishment and authorities were in disarray in the Soviet Union, were indeed these people who were coming Jews under Orthodox law. It caused political problems. Ultimately, it was worked out, as the issue with the Ethiopians is a problem, will be worked out. To characterize this on a racial basis is totally unworthy of what is indeed going on today in Israel.
Dr. Ben?
He speaks of the multiracial characteristic of Israel, but he didn't say that the multiracial characteristic isn't visible in the control in Israel. Israel is controlled by a European-American, and British factor of white Judaism. He doesn't want me to deal with this reality. I've been there umpteen times.
Is that
I've
true,
seen it
Rabbi
for myself.
I would give you two quick answers to that. That historically, yes, because of the nature of the earlier immigration.
Present day.
At this point in time, given the past election results in which Likud, which was heavily representative of the Sephardic community, and Labour, which has its base in the European community, ended up in essential parity. The reality is that power is increasingly shifting from total European control to indeed what is considered a parity between the two communities.
Well, it would seem to be a simple question, Rabbi Seltzer. Do Jews who are European or white control Israel, or do Jews who are African control Israel?
No, it's not that simple, because we're dealing with, no, not at all, because we're dealing with the question of process. And the question of process simply indicates that the initial migration of population out of which the State of Israel was established was European. The governmental structures were created by these people. Immediately after the creation of the state, over 500,000 Sephardic Jews from the Middle East, from North Africa, were brought into the state while it was involved in a fight for independence. These people took the obvious number of years to be able to function effectively on all levels of government, in all levels of Israeli society. Time is a necessary factor in life, but as of this point today, one can say without any hesitation that the non-European Sephardic community wields tremendous power in the State of Israel today.
Who is the dominant power?
And is on. Who is a dominant power? Again, I would indicate that by the last election, in which both Likud and Labor ended up in what is essentially a dead heat, one can learn from this that there is no one group in power anymore.
Dr. Ben?
The rabbi is saying to me that if I went to Israel or you went to Israel, that most of the people in government, the ambassadors traveling all over, are not European American and British Jews. Am I to believe that that's what he's saying, that there's an equal division of power? I can't think that the rabbi will stay there and say this and give this kind of a evasive answer to the question. The European and European American and British Jews still dominate the politics of Israel, still dominate the economy of Israel. And is he saying to me that these people are now welcome? My point to him is, regardless of what rabbis may have said, did they demand that the Jews from Russia go through a new halakha? Do they reconversion? Do they demand a brisk, a brisk circumcision?
Such were the demands. Such were exactly the demands.
Was it carried through?
And just as, and the parallel is a very important one, just as politically the intent of the Orthodox, let me finish please, just as politically the intent of the Orthodox rabbinic establishment could not be considered acceptable, and these demands were ultimately dropped with Soviet Jews, so one finds that as the Ethiopian Jewish community grows, the rabbinate itself has been forced to back down, and I think it is a very clear statement that most Israeli opinion would accept.
We're out of time for this segment.
That is not true, because up to now...
Wait a minute now. I got a cut for a commercial break.
All right.
I know you're hot, both hot. It's a hot program. Hey, this is the last segment you can't run over, and I'm going to chop you if you do. We can't resolve your philosophical, your political, your historical, your ideological differences clearly this hour. But maybe we can address ourselves to tone and intent. Obviously, the letter that was written by the ADL objects to the tone and suggests that there may be some premeditated, sinister, injurious intent to Dr. Ben's remark for political reasons. And perhaps you can clarify that, and perhaps Dr. Ben can rebut and answer, and maybe perhaps we can clarify and heal this rift.
As we read the transcript and as we discussed today, we see much in your remarks that is reflected in third world political statements in the UN, in other forum. The fact that you are indeed Jewish in no way changes the content of these remarks and the political context in which we see them. From our point of view, as Ethiopians were starving and are starving, Israel was the only country that offered the kind of aid to physically bring black Ethiopians out. And indeed, it's the only example of a nation of Caucasians, to use the term that appears frequently here, of bringing in whites, bringing blacks in dignity as citizens. To begin to turn it around says to us, we begin to hear the same kind of third world, radical, political kind of rhetoric, which is directed towards the United Nations, towards Israel and the United Nations, which we hear in so many other forums. This is what we respond to, this willingness to identify Jews and Judaism with colonialism, whites, repression, and having read some of your other material in addition to this, I must say that it's a theme that strikes me as pervasive and something that we find unacceptable in a public forum.
All right.
Number one, you spoke very much about generalized statement. You just said that the Ethiopians are starving and you bring it out. Isn't it a fact that you're talking about only, Ethiopia has about 40 million people. You're talking about 5 miles from the border with Sudan in south, where the starvation situation developed. Isn't it also a fact that the Philistines, the Ethiopians would better Israel, our people were not particularly at that spot? Isn't it a fact that the same United Nations you call on found that many of our community was ready to bring people out? And you talk about the only nation to help. Isn't it also a fact that there are almost every nation in the world in Ethiopia giving assistance to people who are hungry on the northern borders of Ethiopia?
Are you suggesting that it would have been better for Israel to, in no sense, save black lives? Is this what you're suggesting?
Now, you talk about this. No. If Israel had bring them, I was saving us for the reason that you indicated, or tried to indicate, yes. Well, how is it that all of a sudden that we are saved, but we wind up in the army, and we're dying from starvation? We wind up in people's house cleaning, and you know, Falasha never let their women, this is one thing against our principle, to work as domestic in anybody's house. We're doing that now. Why didn't you mention the 4 Falashas last 3 weeks ago that committed suicide over this in Israel? Why didn't you mention the protest meeting in Israel? Why didn't you mention the dialogue between Israel and Ethiopia, that the Falashas they want to go back to Ethiopia, and there's a dialogue about, and the Ethiopian government say, you took them, bring them back?
So the saving of lives by the state of Israel of Jews is another example of racism, according to you.
If you could say it that way, okay. But if you get cheap labor, you don't have to worry about the lives.
And that is the purpose at which the state of Israel brought the Ethiopian community for cheap labor. That is unworthy of a public statement.
Okay, it is. But when we were dying from Mussolini extermination, it is typical of the behavior of European American Jews. You don't want me to say that. Rabbi, you probably live in a racist society yourself. I couldn't probably walk in tonight. You don't want me to deal with the issue.
Had Israel not initiated the Operation Moses, I suspect you would have been among the first who would have said, you see how racist the state of Israel is for not responding to the plight of Jews even though they're black.
It's the biggest mistake.
But now you say that even though they're black, it's a racist response. It's outrageous.
I listened to you.
It's absolutely outrageous.
You don't think that I feel like you're outrageous? Now, my point is this, that a nation that said we don't exist, you know, with the contrition of Israel, the thousands upon thousands of Israelis leaving Israel constantly, you need to replenish that community. You have an Arab situation, and don't deal with me about third world, because I'm not a member of the third world, I'm a member of the first world. You know, Zinzanthropus boys, he was long before Adam and Eve, and it's found in Africa. Lucy is found in Ethiopia, and it's 3.2 million years. You see, you want me to go along with a dialogue that suits you as a European Jew, but doesn't suit me as an African Jew. And you assume that my African Jewishness should supersede my Africanness. No way, Rabbi, because you want it both ways. You want to be a European Jew, benefiting from being a European, benefiting from being a Jew, and that I sat by and listened to it, and then call it anti-Semitic.
You may have difficulty, but the record will show that I sit here as an American Jew.
That's right.
And that will be my definition.
I sit here as an African
How
Jew.
you choose to define me in whatever racial or political terms you have the need is your business. But I reject it totally.
I got to cut you. I thank you both for expressing your opinions so openly.